There are moments when something that once felt natural begins to feel slightly out of place, not in a way that demands attention, but in a way that quietly lingers beneath the surface for longer than you expect. What used to fit without effort may begin to feel less comfortable, even though nothing obvious has changed in your surroundings or in what is expected of you, making it difficult to understand where the shift is coming from. This change does not arrive with clear explanation, and it does not offer immediate clarity, which makes it easy to move past without fully recognizing what is happening within you, because everything can still function as it did before. There is no clear signal that something needs to be questioned, allowing the familiar version of yourself to continue without interruption. That version still responds in ways that have worked for a long time, maintaining patterns that create a sense of stability, even when that stability begins to feel slightly different from the inside. At the same time, there can be a subtle awareness that something no longer sits the same way it used to, as if what once felt natural now requires a quiet adjustment to hold in place. This adjustment is often small enough to be overlooked, and because it does not prevent you from continuing, it can remain present without being fully acknowledged. Over time, this creates a feeling that is difficult to define, where everything appears unchanged, yet something within you no longer feels entirely at ease in the shape it once held. Even when something no longer fits in the same way, there is often a tendency to remain within it, not because it still feels right, but because it is familiar enough to continue without disruption. Familiarity carries a quiet sense of comfort, allowing you to move forward without needing to question what has already been established through repetition. When a version of yourself has been maintained for long enough, it begins to feel stable, even if that stability requires a subtle effort to hold in place. That effort is not always noticeable, and it rarely presents itself as something that needs immediate attention, which makes it easy to continue without recognizing the shift that has already begun. There can be a quiet preference for what is known, since stepping away from it would require facing something that has not yet taken a clear or defined shape. Because of this, staying within what no longer fully fits can feel easier than allowing space for something uncertain to emerge without direction. The absence of clarity can make change feel unnecessary, even when a subtle sense of misalignment continues to remain beneath the surface. In this way, the familiar version continues to be sustained, not because it still reflects who you are, but because it allows you to keep moving without needing to pause and reconsider. When something continues without interruption, it can begin to feel natural, even if it no longer fully aligns with how you feel beneath the surface. There is often no clear signal that something has shifted, and without that signal, there is little reason to question what has already become familiar. What once required effort can begin to feel automatic, allowing patterns to continue in a way that does not draw attention to itself. Because of this, a quiet form of misalignment can exist without being experienced as discomfort, remaining subtle enough to blend into your normal sense of being. The absence of tension can make everything appear stable, even when that stability includes a slight distance that is not immediately recognized. What is experienced most consistently tends to define what feels normal, which makes it difficult to notice when something deeper is no longer fully present. This creates a situation where nothing feels clearly wrong, yet something no longer feels entirely at ease in the way it once did. Without a clear interruption, there is nothing that brings your attention back to what has changed, allowing the familiar version to continue without being questioned. Because this misalignment remains subtle, it does not interrupt your ability to continue, allowing everything to move forward without creating a clear need for change. There is no distinct moment where you recognize that something no longer fits, and without that recognition, the pattern continues in a way that feels uninterrupted. What feels stable on the surface can carry a quiet sense of consistency, even when that consistency includes something that is slightly out of place beneath it. This makes it difficult to distinguish between what is truly aligned and what has simply been maintained long enough to feel normal. The absence of disruption can reinforce the idea that nothing needs to be questioned, allowing the current version of yourself to remain in place without resistance. Because of this, the continuation of the pattern begins to feel natural, not because it fully reflects who you are, but because it does not create friction that would bring attention to it. What remains underneath is not strong enough to interrupt, yet present enough to create a quiet sense that something is being held rather than naturally expressed. In this way, the version that no longer fully fits can continue to exist, supported more by its stability than by how accurately it reflects what you feel within. Even when something no longer feels fully aligned, there is often a quiet tendency to remain within it, not because it still fits, but because it allows everything to continue without interruption. Staying within what is familiar reduces the need to face uncertainty, and uncertainty can feel more difficult to hold than a subtle sense of misalignment that does not demand immediate attention. What is known carries a kind of stability that makes it easier to move forward, even when that movement requires a quiet adjustment to maintain the version that has already been established. This adjustment does not always register as effort, and instead becomes part of how you continue, blending into your actions in a way that feels natural on the surface. Because of this, stepping away from what no longer fits can begin to feel less like a simple change and more like entering something undefined, where there is no clear shape to follow. The absence of a clear alternative can make the current version feel easier to sustain, even when it no longer reflects what is happening beneath your awareness. What remains is not a strong resistance to change, but a quiet preference for what allows continuity, where staying the same feels more manageable than allowing something unfamiliar to take form. In this way, the version that no longer fits continues to be held in place, not through force, but through the subtle ease of remaining within what is already known. As this pattern continues, it begins to reinforce itself in ways that are not immediately visible, allowing it to feel more stable with each repetition. What is repeated often becomes easier to return to, and ease can gradually replace awareness as the primary guide for how you move through your experience. The version of yourself that has been maintained does not need to be actively chosen each time, because it has already settled into a form that continues without requiring attention. This creates a sense of consistency that feels reliable, even when that reliability is built on something that is no longer fully aligned beneath the surface. The more this pattern continues, the less noticeable it becomes, since familiarity has a way of blending into what feels normal rather than standing out as something to question. There is no clear moment where reinforcement happens, and instead, it develops quietly through continuation, shaping how natural the pattern begins to feel. What could have been recognized as a shift remains subtle, because nothing interrupts the flow strongly enough to bring it into focus. At a certain point, the pattern does not feel like something you are maintaining, but something that simply exists as part of how you move through your life. As this pattern becomes more established, it can begin to feel less like something you are continuing and more like something that simply reflects who you are. Repetition has a quiet influence on perception, shaping what feels natural through consistency rather than conscious choice. When a way of being is repeated often enough, it can start to carry a sense of identity, even if it began as a response to something temporary. This shift is not clearly marked, and there is no obvious moment where a pattern becomes part of how you see yourself, which makes it easy for the transition to go unnoticed. What was once an adjustment can begin to feel like a defining trait, and what was once flexible can take on the appearance of something fixed. Because of this, it becomes more difficult to separate what is familiar from what is truly reflective of how you feel beneath the surface. The quieter sense that something no longer fits can remain present, yet it becomes less influential as the established version continues to shape how you respond. At a certain point, the difference between who you are and what you have been maintaining can become less clear, blending into a single experience that feels consistent even when it is slightly out of alignment. As this sense of identity becomes more closely tied to what has been repeated, it can become harder to notice where familiarity ends and something deeper begins. The distinction does not disappear completely, yet it becomes less clear, since what is experienced most often begins to feel like the most accurate reflection of who you are. Because of this, the quieter awareness that something no longer fits can remain present, but it no longer stands out in the same way it once might have. What used to feel like a subtle difference can begin to blend into the overall experience, making it harder to separate what feels natural from what is simply well practiced. This creates a kind of quiet merging, where patterns and identity begin to overlap, not through intention, but through repetition that has gone on long enough to feel consistent. As this continues, awareness may shift toward maintaining what feels stable rather than questioning whether that stability still reflects what is true beneath the surface. There is no clear boundary that signals when this blending has taken place, which allows it to remain unnoticed while shaping how you interpret your own experience. The result is not confusion, but a softened awareness where the difference between what fits and what no longer does becomes less distinct and therefore less likely to be questioned. Even within this softened awareness, there can be moments where something begins to stand out again, not as a strong interruption, but as a quiet sense that feels slightly different from everything else. These moments are often brief, and they do not always form into clear thoughts, yet they carry a subtle quality that is difficult to ignore once it is noticed. What had blended into the background can begin to separate just enough to be felt, creating a small distinction between what feels familiar and what feels quietly true. This does not happen all at once, and it does not arrive with certainty, but rather through moments where your attention lingers just a little longer than usual. In those moments, something that was previously overlooked can begin to feel more defined, not because it has changed, but because it is no longer being passed over as quickly. There can be a sense of recognition that does not need explanation, where the difference between what fits and what does not becomes slightly more noticeable without becoming overwhelming. This recognition does not force action, and it does not demand change, yet it introduces a quiet clarity that was not as accessible before. As these moments repeat in their own way, they begin to gather a presence that feels steady, allowing what was once difficult to notice to become something you can no longer completely overlook. As this subtle recognition begins to stay with you for longer periods, it can start to influence how you move through situations, not in a way that feels forced, but in a way that quietly shifts your sense of direction. What once felt automatic may no longer carry the same ease, and certain choices can begin to feel slightly different, even when nothing has changed externally. This difference does not create urgency, yet it introduces a quiet awareness that remains present as you continue, making it harder to move in exactly the same way as before. You may notice that some responses feel less natural, while others begin to carry a sense of steadiness that was not as noticeable previously. These shifts do not demand immediate change, and they do not require clear decisions. Yet, they begin to influence how you engage with what is in front of you. Rather than following the same patterns without interruption, there can be a slight pause, a moment where something is felt before it is acted upon. This pause does not slow everything down completely, yet it creates enough space for something different to be considered, even if that difference is not immediately followed. As this continues, direction is not changed through a single decision, but through a series of small adjustments that gradually move you away from what no longer fits. As these subtle shifts continue, they can begin to gather a clearer presence, not in a way that feels sudden, but in a way that gradually becomes more difficult to overlook. What once appeared as brief moments of awareness can start to remain with you for longer, shaping how you interpret what you experience rather than passing by unnoticed. There can be a growing sense that something within you is becoming more defined, even if it does not yet form into clear conclusions or decisions. This does not create pressure to act, yet it introduces a steadiness that feels different from the patterns that once guided you without question. What felt easy before may now carry a slight sense of hesitation, while what once felt uncertain can begin to feel quietly grounded in a way that does not require explanation. This shift does not replace your existing way of being all at once, and instead exists alongside it, creating a contrast that becomes easier to recognize over time. As this contrast becomes clearer, it can begin to influence not only what you notice, but how you relate to what you notice, bringing a deeper sense of awareness into moments that once felt automatic. There is no single moment where clarity arrives fully formed, yet there is a gradual sense that something within you is becoming more aligned, even if the shape of that alignment is still unfolding. A quiet sense of alignment can begin to take shape before it ever becomes something you decide to act on, appearing first as a feeling that subtly changes how moments are experienced. Certain situations may begin to register differently, even when your outward responses remain similar, creating a space where something internal no longer fully matches what is being expressed. This shift does not demand immediate action, and it does not create urgency. Yet it introduces a presence that remains steady beneath what continues on the surface. What once felt neutral may now carry a slight resistance that is difficult to ignore once noticed, while something that once felt uncertain can begin to feel grounded without needing explanation. There is no conflict that needs to be resolved. Yet there is a growing contrast, where what feels true internally no longer overlaps completely with what is being maintained externally. Because this awareness is felt rather than defined, it can remain difficult to describe, even as it becomes more consistent across different moments. A form of recognition begins to develop, not through analysis, but through repeated experiences where something within you responds in a way that feels more natural and less constructed. At a certain point, returning fully to what no longer fits becomes harder, not because it is impossible, but because the difference has become too clear to move past in the same way. At a certain point, the difference becomes too clear to move past in the same way, even if nothing has been outwardly changed yet. What once felt easy to return to may now carry a quiet sense of distance, making it difficult to fully settle back into the version that used to feel natural. This does not create a sharp break, and it does not force you into immediate change, yet it alters how that previous version is experienced from within. There can be moments where you try to move as you did before, only to notice that something no longer aligns in the same way, creating a subtle awareness that stays with you even after the moment passes. The familiarity is still there, and it can still be followed, but it no longer carries the same sense of ease that once made it feel like an accurate reflection of who you are. Because of this, returning does not feel like returning, and continuing in the same way begins to feel more like holding on to something rather than naturally moving within it. There is no need to reject what once fit, and no need to push it away. Yet there is a growing understanding that it no longer supports you in the same way it once did. This understanding does not arrive as a final decision, but it changes the relationship you have with that version, making it harder to remain fully within it without noticing the shift. From here, movement begins to feel different, not because everything has changed, but because what you are aware of has changed in a way that cannot be easily set aside. There is a point where nothing needs to be decided for the shift to feel real, where the change has already taken place quietly within you, long before it becomes visible in what you do. What once required effort to notice now feels naturally present, not as something you have to search for, but as something that remains with you without needing to be held in place. The version of you that no longer fits does not need to be rejected or pushed away, because it was once necessary, and it carried you through moments where it made sense to exist in that form. What changes is not the value of that version, but your relationship to it, as it gradually becomes something you can recognize without needing to remain inside. There can be a quiet sense of appreciation for what it allowed you to move through, without needing to return to it in the same way again. This recognition does not close anything off, and it does not create a clear ending, but it allows space for something else to continue forming without resistance. Nothing needs to be rushed, and nothing needs to be forced into clarity, because what is emerging does not depend on immediate definition in order to be real. From here, movement can feel softer, not because everything is certain, but because you are no longer trying to fit into something that has already begun to loosen its hold. What remains is not a final version, but an openness that allows you to continue without needing to become fixed in the same way again.